We're doing something we haven't normally done. We're actually doing a formal debate with people who actually know what they're talking about. Usually our motive is to find people who don't know what they're talking about and just watch them duel it out. And that's entertaining, but I'm hoping this can also be entertaining. Today we are, we are, we have our guests. Let me just unmute you guys. Ryan Mullins and Stephen, I'm really going to try not to butcher your last name. Kershnar, is that correct?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this debate. Today, we are debating the topic theism is coherent. Now, we are also joined by Coco, host of, Day of Debates. Is that correct, Coco? Awesome. So our guests today have decided to introduce themselves, which is really good for me. It saves me the headache of trying to pronounce things that I don't know how to pronounce when I'm introducing them. So first off, Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am a professor and master coordinator for the University of Lucerne's online master's program in philosophy, theology, and religions. I've got a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews and a doctoral habilitation in dogmatics from the University of Helsinki, which also apparently gives me the title of docent of dogmatics, which sounds really cool. I don't know exactly what it means, but there you have it. I've written some books, some papers. We can talk about those later.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Stephen, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Steve Kershnar. I'm the distinguished teaching professor at SUNY Fredonia. I have a PhD and a JD. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Coco, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're joining us today.
Hey, my name is Mr. Coco. I host professional debates on TikTok. I try to bring debates to TikTok. I'm one of 3 hosts of Day of Debates. The other 2 hosts are AR and OG Kylo. And then I also host The Controversial Compass, a space where the best ideas win. That's my platform. And then Day of Debates is an initiative where we're trying to bring professional debates to TikTok. I debate people, I host debates, and that's my shtick, basically.
Awesome. All right, guys. So we've all talked beforehand. We all collectively agreed that we're going to start with 10-minute openers, 5-minute rebuttals, and then 5-minute cross-examination. For those who are not familiar, in the cross-examination area, we're going to have one of the debaters question the other debaters. And in this situation, they are allowed to interrupt each other if they feel like they're not answering the question and take back their time. It's not considered rude. It's just part of the debate format. And then we'll finish with closing statements, about 3 minutes each. And then we'll have about 15 minutes where you can ask questions. So if you want to make sure your question gets through, send it through in a super chat and we'll make sure we get it. If you can't do a super chat, just send it however you can. We're going to try to look out for them. If you have a question for a specific debater, if it's for Ryan, put an R at the beginning, so capital R, maybe a couple dots. If it's for Stephen, put an S at the beginning, couple dots, and then we will know to address it to them specifically. Gentlemen, are you ready to get started?
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to hand over the floor to Ryan Mullins. Ryan, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so someone on Facebook asked me to make this exciting, and instead I told them I'm going to make this as boring as possible. So let's get into this. So I believe that theism is coherent. And before you can test if a hypothesis is true, you need to see if the hypothesis is in fact coherent, because incoherent theories cannot possibly be true. And so this is why I think the question of the debate is important. If the very idea of God is incoherent, then there's no point in considering arguments for and against the existence of God. But I'm going to say that the concept of God is coherent. I take the concept of God to be that of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And I think this basic concept is coherent. But it's a fairly thin concept, as most concepts are. Where things get interesting is when people put forward a conception or a model of God. And a model of God is a unique articulation of what it means to be perfect and what it means to be the ultimate foundation of reality. And so when I'm saying these things, I have something else in the back of my mind. And so I want to make that more explicit. So like many people in Western history, I have in the back of my mind the notion of the great chain of being. The great chain of being is God's mental representation of all the possible beings that could exist in their wide variety of variations and degrees of greatness. And a common assumption is that anything located on the great chain of being has some sort of potential degree of intrinsic value, such that if that being were to exist, it would instantiate that value. Now, there are many different kinds of values represented on the great chain of being. And I take it as obvious that there are more values in reality than moral values. So, for example, this present debate has lots of different values like entertainment value and perhaps the value of intellectual stimulation. And so, my claim is that God is at the top of the great chain of being and is the source of the chain. And this is because God is the greatest possible being and the ultimate foundation of reality. But this raises a question. What does it mean to say that God is perfect or the greatest being? God is perfect in that God essentially has all of the great making properties or attributes. Great making properties, well, these are properties that it is better to have than not have, all things considered. These are attributes that make the possessor intrinsically great overall and not relatively great to some sort of subset of possible beings. So, what a model of God is trying to do is offer some sort of unique articulation of which attributes best capture the notion of perfection in that basic concept of God. But the thing is, a lot of models of God, they disagree over these various attributes. Some people want to say timelessness is in there, others want to say temporality, some say simplicity, some say no, that's nonsense. It's unity. Others say impassibility, others say passibility. So what I call these the contested divine attributes because they're attributes that philosophers and theologians really disagree over quite substantially. Whereas other attributes are relatively uncontested in the sense that most models of God agree on them. And so what I'm going to do is primarily focus on the uncontested attributes, the ones that most people agree on. So I start with necessary existence, aseity, and self-sufficiency. So God exists necessarily. That just means God cannot fail to exist. God must exist. However, not all things that necessarily exist are ase or self-sufficient. So aseity is a distinct attribute which describes God's independent existence. God's existence is not asymmetrically dependent upon, nor is it derived from something else. Because after all, you can't be the greatest if your existence depends on something else. And then the same thing goes for God's essence or nature. So God is self-sufficient in that God's essence or nature does not depend upon, nor is it derived from something external to God. Because again, you cannot be the greatest if your essence depends on something else. Now, notice that everything I've just said logically entails that God is an eternal being. To be eternal is to exist without beginning and without end. If God must exist, then God will exist without beginning and without end. Next attribute I want to talk about is omnipotence. I take it as obvious that omnipotence is a great making property, because I think omnipotence is obviously intrinsically valuable. And at the very least, it's a prerequisite for other values like moral perfection. In order to see this, I need you to consider the following. So omnipotence is the most power-granting set of abilities, which logically excludes liabilities or weaknesses. Now, I should not have to say that last part out loud, but most people miss the entailment. This is because not all things that we call in English abilities, not everything we say in English that is ability, they're not all powers. Some things we call abilities in English are actually liabilities. For example, the ability to have mistaken beliefs, that's a weakness and not a power, and thus will be logically excluded from the most power-granting set of abilities. Instead, God will have cognitive excellence, which covers the powers pertaining to beliefs, rationality, and emotions. And this entails that God has the power to know all that is possible to know and to know things in the right way where God is not going to be subject to like cognitive defects, epistemic vices, or mistaken beliefs. So in other words, God is omniscient. So God is omniscient if for any proposition that it is logically possible to know, God knows of the truth value of that proposition in its appropriate context and utterance. Now, I take cognitive excellence to exclude the so-called ability to perform irrational actions. This is because the so-called ability to perform irrational actions, well, that's really a liability or a weakness. So it will not be included in the most power-granting set of abilities because it's a weakness and not a power. What this means is that God's cognitive excellence entails the power of perfect rationality. So God is perfectly rational if and only if God is appropriately responsive to objectively good reasons for his actions. So God's perfect rationality and moral perfection, they are mutually entailing because moral considerations are one set of reasons for acting. So the weakness of performing morally bad actions is logically excluded from the power of perfect rationality. Now, God is perfectly morally good if and only if God is appropriately responsive to morally relevant values. So, in this way, a morally good agent is rational because it is rational to be responsive to moral values. And a perfectly good person always does what she has most objective reason to do. And as omniscient, God will always know what he has most objective reason to do. And then as omnipotent, God will be free to perform the action that he has most objective reason to do. So, as I see it, the most power granting set of abilities must include the power to perform free and efficacious actions. In other words, omnipotence entails free will. Now, an agent is free in that one, the agent is the source of her intentional actions, two, performs her intentional actions for a reason, and then three, is able to perform or refrain from performing her intentional actions in the absence of any decisive reasons. So, decisive reasons, these are reasons that are so powerful that rationality demands that the agent has to perform them. But in most cases, like agents like you and me and God, we are only presented with justifying reasons. So, mere justifying reasons, these are objectively good reasons to perform an action, but they are not so powerful that the agent must do them. The agent would be rational in refraining from acting. So, thus far, I've claimed that God is a necessarily existent, eternal being with attributes like aseity, self sufficiency, omnipotence, cognitive excellence, perfect rationality, perfect moral goodness, and free will. And I take these to be great making properties that God has essentially. And any claim that theism is incoherent, it must point out some sort of contradiction. Perhaps that a single property is incoherent all by itself, or that two or more of these attributes are incoherent when they're combined in some sort of way. And so, with that being said, I will invite my dialogue partner to spot the contradiction in the very idea of God.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that opening statement. I'm going to try to pretend that I understood what every one of those words meant. That's my goal. We're going to hand over the floor to Stephen next. And Stephen, you do have a PowerPoint you want to bring up. Do you want me to pull that up now?
Yes, if you would, please. That would be
awesome.
Great.
All right, Stephen, the floor is yours whenever you are ready.
Great. Okay. Before I begin, I really want to thank the host of this, of the Big John Steele site for having me. I greatly appreciate it. And it's truly a real honor and a pleasure to be discussing this with a philosopher as absolutely talented as insightful as Ryan. I mean, it's great to be with someone that good. All right. My claim is that theism isn't coherent. All right. So is that okay? Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just a brief legal note. This work is my own, doesn't reflect anyone else. The one exception is Nathan Bray, sort of co-researcher of mine. A lot of the ideas are his, so he does bear responsibility for the views put forth. Okay, so I'm going to defend two theses. First, I'm going to claim that if theism is coherent, then God is the greatest possible being. And the second, I'm going to claim that God is not the greatest possible being. If those things are true, then theism is not coherent. And my overall strategy is to say that if the notion of God is coherent, then he's the greatest possible being. And if that's true, then he's going to have to be morally responsible, right? So crudely apt for praise and blame. And also he's going to have a unique maximal value. That is, the maximum amount of value. And there's only one way that it can be exemplified. And he's got to be independent. Okay, so let me just briefly go over some of these concepts. By God, I'm going to say neutral on whether God is a proper name or whether it has descriptive content. For example, the greatest possible being or perfect being. I think the latter is probably true, but I'm going to say neutral on this. Second, the modal ontological argument says roughly that because the greatest possible being is possible, he exists. And this relates to the fourth feature, which is that I'm going to assume that the greatest possible being is independent. That is an extrinsic thing of randomness. Does not determine his existence, his essence or his existence. Okay, and then what do I mean by responsible? I mean responsibility. So directly, I think it's a basic property. That is, you can't analyze it. But in ordinary terms, it's something being apt for praise and blame or basically deserving praise and blame. Okay, so those are the concepts. So what I'm going to argue for each one of these two theses. Let's consider the first thesis, that if theism is coherent, then God is the greatest possible being. Okay, my argument for this rests on the three best arguments for God's existence all assume this. Cosmological argument says that there are different versions of it, but the the principle of sufficient reason version, one that I think is the best, says that you can't have unexplained things. So if you had nothing but an infinite sequence of dependent beings, that would be impossible. There would be something that's unexplained. Either you would need a first being or you'd need something to explain the infinite sequence. The fine-tuning argument says that the universe looks very much like it's been fine-tuned to support life, and life seems to be necessary for intelligent life, and intelligent life is the best thing that can happen. Okay, so I claim that both of these presuppose the modal ontological argument. Again, the modal ontological argument says that if the greatest possible being is possible, then he has to have every perfection or every great making feature. One of those great making features is going to be independence, which itself entails necessary existence. More crudely, if a greatest possible being is possible, then a greatest possible being exists. The cosmological argument assumes the modal ontological argument. Why? Because the cosmological argument says that everything has an explanation, but you can't have an unexplained explainer. So what explains God? God explains himself. That is, God's essence explains why he exists. The fine-tuning argument says that when you have incredible complexity, you have to have a designer. But how can you have an undesigned designer? We can have an undesigned designer if that thing were to explain itself. How would it explain itself? It would explain itself if it's the greatest possible being. That is, its maximal greatness or its perfection explains why it's both possible and why it's actual. Okay, so the second part says, okay, so if that's right, then all of establishes that if theism is coherent, then God is the greatest possible being. But we want to ask, is a greatest possible being possible? And I want to claim that it's not. If God is the greatest possible being, then he's responsible or he has maximal intrinsic value, right? I take it that these are both great makers. I actually think he has to have both, but at the very least, he has to have one of the two. That is, he has to be morally responsible. That is apt for praise and blame, or basically deserving praise and blame. And he has to have maximal intrinsic moral value. Why intrinsic moral value? Well, because we're not interested in extrinsic value. We're not interested in what sort of being he replaces or what sort of good results he brings about. We want to know whether he himself is valuable. Why moral value? I think moral value is the only thing that counts. Other sorts of value, if you could have, for example, intrinsic sexual value, something like that, intrinsic hockey value, these are not the sort of things that's going to explain why something has to exist. And I'm going to claim that God is neither responsible nor has maximal intrinsic value. If those things are true, then from the earlier premise, it follows that theism is incoherent. So why would I think that premise 4 is true? That God is neither responsible nor has maximal intrinsic value. Okay, well, let's consider, and the idea here is that in addition to being omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient, God's also going to have to be omni-responsible. That is, he has to be fully responsible or maximally responsible. Okay, but God is not maximally responsible. Here are going to be 3 arguments that show that. Number 1, God is not significantly responsible. You're significantly responsible only if you're responsible choosing between good and evil. But God can't choose evil, and he knows it, so he's not responsible for avoiding evil. If his psychology is essentially all good, then he can't have an evil attitude. And if he can't have an evil attitude, he can't be motivated to do evil. If he can't be motivated to do evil, he can't decide to do evil. And if he can't decide to do evil, then he can't perform evil. Well, if God cannot perform evil, then he's not praiseworthy for avoiding it. That is, he's not significantly responsible because he's not responsible for refraining from performing evil acts. What about compulsion? Think about a kleptomaniac. Kleptomaniac has an internal compulsion to steal. This person doesn't seem to be responsible because their psychology compels them in the sense that it dictates what they think and what they decide. Well, this person's not going to be responsible. Nor is someone who's a kleptophobe. That is someone who has an internal compulsion not to steal. Or kleptocorrect, someone who steals when and only when it's correct to do so. But God is in the same condition. He is an essential, his psychology has essentially a certain content, and this content dictates what he thinks and what he decides. So he's no more responsible than the kleptocorrect person is. Lastly, consider instant creation. Consider a manipulated being. Consider a being like Patty Hearst if she were fully brainwashed. She would not be responsible. Now imagine that Patty Hearst is instantly created from nothing by God, but with the same psychology she has after she's manipulated. She would no more be responsible. She acted immediately after creation than if she were manipulated. If she has her psychology essentially, she'd be no more responsible than if she was instantly created. And God's psychology is an essential feature of him. So he's like an essentially configured individual. So 3 reasons to think that God's not responsible. He's not significantly responsible because he's can't do evil. He's not responsible because he's compelled, and he's like a instantly created being. Okay. What about is God uniquely maximally great? Well, there's 2 possibilities here. Either he is or he's not. Both of these produce incoherencies. I should go back just real quickly. If you think that God's not responsible, there's going to be problems with why we should worship him, why we should be grateful to someone who's not responsible, why we'd accept the free will defense, and how we make sense of heaven and hell. Okay, but let's think about whether God's a uniquely maximally great being. You might think he's not uniquely the maximally great being because there are different ways to exemplify the greatest possible being. I mean, 2 greatest possible beings might have different preferences with regard to the color, the type of orange that you find in a puffin, for example, or in terms of the brute preferences. Or you might think infinity is impossible, in which case there's not going to be a maximal greatness because you could always add one more great making feature or having one more degree of a great making feature. Or you might think that there's no maximal infinity because there's an infinite sequence of infinities. Right? You might think there's different cardinalities, in which case there's no maximum. Under either of these conditions, there's no greatest possible being. Alternatively, you might think that if God were a uniquely great being, then he wouldn't be. Then there's no reason for him to create the world. He's already maxed out the good. Why create a world when you're not making the world a better place by creating a world outside of you?
Time's up. Finish your last sentence.
Okay, sorry. But even if you do create the best possible world, how do you select which world to create? God's not independent, so he's not the greatest possible being.
Stephen, how much more would you say that you had left?
I'm done. Sorry.
You're done?
It's hard to see the screen to see where
okay.
I am.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Stephen.
Okay.
Ryan, are you good to just jump straight back into the rebuttals, or?
Yeah. So that's fine. Yeah, I can do this.
Okay, awesome. All right, so we're going to hand it over now to Ryan Mullins to rebuttal back. He's going to be given 5 minutes to do so. Sir, whenever you are ready.
Okay, so Steve has given us some interesting objections that I wish we had more time to develop. But I'm going to at least point out that I reject some of the underlying assumptions and some of the claims in these objections. So to start, I think God is uniquely perfect in the sense of essentially having all of the great-making properties or perfections. I do not think there are multiple ways of being perfect, though I acknowledge there are people who disagree about which attributes they think are included in perfection. Now, nothing about God's perfection needs to involve any notion of infinity. So several of the objections that we saw at the very end, like they seem to kind of have this equation, like equating maximal with infinity. But I want to deny that terms like maximal necessarily imply anything about infinity. Instead, maximal typically implies some sort of logical limit or some sort of unique package. So, for example, when philosophers say that possible worlds are maximally consistent propositions, or that moments of time are maximally consistent proposition-like entities, they're not implying anything about infinity. They're talking about some sort of unique, logically consistent package of things. So I want to reject Steve's claim that God cannot be maximal because I reject the assumption that maximal has any necessary connections to infinity. And in fact, weirdly enough, in my opening statement, I never even used the superlative of maximal when I was describing God, because I try to get rid of some of these superlatives when I can, because I think they're often fuzzy and prevent clear definitions. So, for example, when I said God is omnipotent, I said God has the most power-granting set of abilities. And this doesn't imply an infinite number of powers, but instead refers to some sort of logically possible package of power-granting abilities. I also want to deny that responsibility is an essential great-making property. Responsibility is a basic property that one acquires if one performs a free action that is subject to praise or blame. And so notice that this is a property that comes along with the performance of a free action. So since free actions are contingent and accidental, they cannot be essential, and so they can't be an essential divine attribute. But I do think that God can be praised for doing good things when he freely decides to do something. Uh, they didn't have to do that. We can talk more about that during the cross-examination, is my guess. Hopefully we can. So the issue of divine freedom, though, I see no reason to think God is compelled to create. Instead, I think that there's some more ambiguities and assumptions about the term maximal that I want to reject. So allow me to articulate things as I understand it without relying on any terms like maximal. So prior to creation, God has many creative options about the kinds of possible universes and possible creatures that he could produce. And each possible universe has some like certain potential value in itself, and then it also has an associated value relative to God's goals or purposes. And depending on what God's goals are, different kinds of universes may or may not satisfy that divine goal. And God is able to compare different kinds of goals and is able to compare the ways that these different universes satisfy those goals. I deny that there is a best possible goal, and I also want to deny that there's a best possible world. So I deny that God is presented with any decisive reasons to create. Instead, God is presented with merely justifying reasons to create. It would be rational for God to act on the basis of any of those justifying reasons, and there's nothing irrational about refraining from acting in the case of merely justifying reasons. So whichever set of justifying reasons God chooses to act on will render his action rational. Now, it might be the case that God is presented with many goals worth pursuing and many different kinds of universes that could satisfy those goals. And if this is the case, God will perform what I call a nested arbitrary action, which is a perfectly rational thing to do. It would be irrational to perform an utterly arbitrary action, which is an action that is performed for no reason whatsoever. Whereas a nested arbitrary action is when one has a good reason to perform a course of actions, but part of that course of actions involves just selecting from many good actions, any of which will advance your overall course of action. So if you don't just pick something like from one of your options, your entire rational course of actions will be frustrated. So thus, you have a good reason to just pick something. And we do this all the time. There's nothing irrational about it because we have good reason to do it. And in fact, philosophers have lots of categories for trying to capture this. We've got these notions like satisficing and submaximal optimization. So when it comes to the exercise of God's freedom in creation, there are meaningful and coherent ways to state why God would create, and meaningful and coherent ways for describing how God compares his options. And none of this involves any utterly arbitrary actions from the uniquely perfect God.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. Stephen, how you feeling? You ready to jump right into your rebuttal?
Please, absolutely.
Awesome. Floor is yours. Whenever you're ready, we'll start the time.
I'm ready. Really enjoying the conversation, so thank you, guys. My first response, I'm going to make 4 responses to Ryan's excellent points. The first is it's not clear the features that Ryan points out are consistent with one another. Take the 3 O's. If God is essentially all good, and there's certain actions he can't perform. He can't perform acts of evil. Now, Ryan's going to say these are liabilities, but nevertheless, they're things that I can do that he can't do. Well, it's kind of an odd view that's not a real task if I can perform it and he can't. So it seems that omnibenevolence conflicts with omnipotence. Omnibenevolence also seems to conflict with omniscience. There's certain things I could know, the joys of doing evil. But if something's essentially omnibenevolent, he cannot know that. So those 2 O's contradict each other. So the notion that you don't have to choose between the various omni properties seems to be mistaken. In fact, they contradict each other. There's at most 1 O, and I think you have to, in terms of explanatory priority, say which omni property gets priority. In terms of moral responsibility, Ryan seemed to say, well, I wasn't quite clear what his response is, but you might think God should clearly be responsible. I mean, we think that when we worship God, we're grateful. But why be grateful to someone who's not responsible? Why be grateful to a robot, or why be grateful to the weather? That is, we should be grateful toward and only toward responsible beings. And now, I also argue that God was not responsible. And I think those arguments have held up. I mean, it seems clear that God cannot perform evil acts, so he's not responsible for avoiding evil. Saying that God's free is both false. He's not free to perform an evil act in the sense because he's essentially omnibenevolent. And in any case, he can't choose to perform an evil act, and you can't perform an act that you can't choose to do. In addition, God's compelled by his essential psychology. He's every bit as compelled as someone who was manipulated, like the hypothetical Patty Hearst case I brought out, where there's full manipulation, or where there's instant creation, when Patty Hearst is created from nothing by God and acts immediately after creation. It's hard to see why she'd be responsible, given that she didn't in any deep way control her psychology, and therefore she can't control the decisions that flow from her psychology, at least immediately after creation or manipulation. Now, Ryan said I didn't say anything about that. He didn't say anything about infinity. But when you're talking about maximal amounts of good things, it seems that's either finite or infinite. If God is essentially all good, he has a certain number of good attitudes, and each attitude has a certain amount of intensity. But if that's not an infinite number of attitudes or an infinite intensity per attitude, then it seems that God could have better attitudes or more attitudes. The only way to avoid that is if there's an infinite amount. But if it's an infinite amount, then we're stuck in defending whether or not there is a maximal amount of infinity. And I'll finish it up with talking about whether God is compelled to create the universe. If God is not compelled to create the universe, perhaps because he already maxes out the amount of intrinsic value in the world, and he's creating a universe outside of himself, doesn't make the universe any better. So it'd be arbitrary whether he creates a universe outside of himself or not. If he's creating a universe, it would be arbitrary how good the universe is. Does it have 1 unit of goodness, 756, 9,000, or 4 billion? You might think, well, he just picks one at random. But if God acts on a purely arbitrary basis, that is, he has no justifying or contrastive reason for choosing whether to create a universe as to whether outside of himself or whether not to do so, or whether to create a particular universe rather than something else, it's a completely arbitrary choice. And God is not responsible for a completely arbitrary choice. Here's an analogy, and then I'll stop. Imagine that someone, Jones, is compelled to give you a box of Rice Krispies. I should mention I'm stealing this example from Klaus Cray and from Nathan Bray. But there's a million different boxes that are identical they could choose from. So he's compelled to give you a box of Rice Krispies, but it's arbitrary which one he gives you. Why would he think he's praiseworthy for giving us box 456 rather than some other box? We shouldn't. But my claim is that's exactly the view the theist puts forth regarding whether to create a universe outside of himself and which universe to create. So in short, I've argued that the O's are not consistent, that God is not responsible, intuitively that's a flaw, that a maximum amount of goodness, for example, a maximum amount of anything entails some sort of infinity. And lastly, if God is not, does not have a sufficient reason to create a universe or which universe to create, he acts arbitrarily, and that contradicts his independence. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. I just got to say one thing real quick. I'm always grateful for a box of Rice Krispies. Doesn't matter where it comes from. So that's just me. So what we're going to do now, guys, is we are going to get into the cross-examination. So like I said at the start, this is where we will give one of the debaters a little bit more power. So it's going to start with Ryan. He's going to be quizzing Stephen, and Ryan's going to be allowed to run the conversation here. So if he feels like his question's not being answered, he's allowed to interrupt and draw it back and buy back his time. So don't consider it rude. It's just part of the debate. Ryan, are you good to go?
Yeah. So I want to start with the compulsion and the instant creation, because I don't think you had enough time to really explain this. So as I see it, I'm thinking here, like, you're wanting to say that God's like psychology and his free actions, they're not really free, because it's just like these manipulation cases or this creation of an instantly created being. But I think there's a disanalogy, because in the compulsion cases that you were looking at, the manipulation cases, there's some external manipulator, and then with the instantly created being, that like its nature is being externally imposed upon it by whatever's creating it. That's not the case with God. So I might be missing something, but that's what I was thinking. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more about this.
Sure, great, I appreciate it. So I guess we kind of could agree that if Patty Hearst were fully brainwashed, she would be compelled and she wouldn't be responsible. Okay, that would be good. And if Patty Hearst were like instantly created from nothing, she wouldn't be responsible. Now imagine that Patty Hearst has her psychology essentially. Perhaps it comes out through random forces, or perhaps she just, however you would come about, she would be no more responsible than if she were manipulated or if she were instantly created. But you might ask yourself, why is God any different than these things, right? He has no more deep control over psychology than a fully manipulated being, than an instantly created being, or being with an essential psychology. So if those three are not responsible, if Patty Hearst is not responsible in those three cases, neither is God.
Right. So I guess what I'm thinking is when I'm looking at manipulation cases and this creation case, uh, one of the main things is doing the undermining of the freedom is that these are like externally imposed upon the agent, whereas that's not the case with God. And there's a second disanalogy. I didn't think of this until just now. The second disanalogy is when we're trying to come up with like an ultimate explanation of reality. We're looking for something where there's no further questions to ask, and perfection is supposed to be like one of these stopping points where there's nothing left to ask. Whereas when I'm looking at the Patty Hearst case, like it's like, why was she manipulated this way? Why did she get brainwashed this way? Like there's a bunch of questions that immediately pop up. Same thing with the instant created being. So I think there's two disanalogies. The biggest one is the external imposition on it, and then the second one being with the case of God, like we've got a natural stopping point for why God has the psychology he does, whereas with its perfection, which feels like perfection shouldn't be undermining anything. Whereas with the Patty Hearst case and the instant created being case, there's a bunch of questions that pop up that are unsatisfied that are explained by something external that does the undermining. I don't know if I said that very well, but do you kind of get what I'm getting at though?
Yeah, I think those are two great points. I'll respond to them, but again, I think that's points. Number one, isn't the case of the three Patty Hearst cases, isn't that better explained in terms of an external agent? Isn't that what's undermining the responsibility? And the answer to that is no. What really explains it is the lack of deep control of Patty Hearst under those three cases for being able to control her thinking or her psychology. So let's imagine that God's essence, that is his essential nature, his perfection, explains why he has the psychology he has and why he exists. Well, he has no more control over what he thinks or what he does than Patty Hearst does. The fact that there's no extrinsic agent is really beside the point. So I like your point, but I have to respectfully disagree because I don't think that's what explains the difference. In terms of God being the ultimate explanation of himself, I'm not sure how that's related to responsibility. That might explain why God has the psychology that he has, but it doesn't explain why he has deep control in any way. Now, there's also a problem. I claim that if there is different ways to have a greatest possible being, then of course he's not going to be the ultimate explanation of why he exists. But you deny that. But yeah, let me just say that even if he's the ultimate explanation of why he exists and has the nature that he does, his psychology that does, what does that have to do with the deep control that's required for responsibility?
Mm-hmm. How much time do we have left? I didn't know if I want to get into a different topic.
46 seconds.
46 seconds. Okay.
I didn't get that. Apologies.
Gosh, yeah, that's not enough time to. Yeah, that's fine. Let's go on to the next thing.
If Steven's willing to, we can add an additional minute onto each one of your guys' times if you had another question.
I mean, I do want to hear the next question. I would like to please give him a few minutes. If necessary, give him a minute or two out of my time.
Sure. Okay. So I wanted to hear.
Give me 1 second. I set the timer.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Let's see. And you can start now.
So I wanted to ask you more about the claim that God's not responsible, because what I was thinking is responsibility is not an essential attribute of God, but it would be something like an accidental property. Like if God decides to create something, well, then he's going to have to be responsible for it because there's always consequences for your actions. Is that? I guess how would that change your argument? I guess is what I'm curious.
So if you thought that responsibility was an accidental property, so long as it has to be a property of God, whether it's a primary or a derivative property, doesn't matter, as long as it's a great maker. So my claim is that God is not responsible. He's lacking great maker, whether it's whether it's a fundamental property or derived property, it doesn't matter for my account.
Okay, because so I'm gonna deny that if it's that it's a great making property, because if it's accidental, it can't be great making, because great making properties have to be essential properties that are better to have than not have. So freely performing an action, I don't see how that's going to be a great making property. Whereas having free will, like that seems like that's great making. So this, I guess, this is where I'm trying to see like how to develop the disagreement like a bit more tightly.
So just real quick, I know we're short on
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
I think free will is not itself important. Free will is relevant because and only because it leads to responsibility. The focus on free will, just in general in the free will literature and among theists, is a mistake. We care about free will because we care about responsibility.
Okay, interesting. There we go.
Just ran out of
Awesome.
time. That was perfect.
Perfect. All right. Well, Stephen, you gave him another minute, so we're going to give you 6 minutes on the clock for your cross examination. Whenever you start, we'll start the time.
So I'm curious as to what you think about the Rice Krispies case. If it were the case that Jones he was compelled by his essential psychology to give you a box of Rice Krispies, but he got to choose which of a million different boxes of Rice Krispies to give to you. So he chooses box 456. My view is, do you think that so the decision is entirely arbitrary. His motivation is locked in. It's not something over which he has deep control. Do you think that he is praiseworthy for giving you box 456 of Rice Krispies or giving you any box of Rice Krispies? And how that's different from God's creating the world in general or creating a particular world?
Yeah, I guess the disanalogy for me is I don't think that God is compelled to create because I think that because I deny best possible world. I don't see any decisive reason for God to create. I think God has justifying reasons, but not decisive reasons to create. So to go back to the Rice Krispie case, I guess it would be Jones sees that it'd be really good to give you some Rice Krispies. He doesn't have to though, but it'd be good if he did. And then he's like, well, okay, well, I think it's good to do that. I'm going to act on the basis of those good reasons. Now, which one do I do? Well, I got to pick something because otherwise, my like this good of giving you Rice Krispies is going to be frustrated. So so this is why it's going to be a nested arbitrary action because it's nested within this overall course of a good course of actions, which is giving you Rice Krispie treats. And so just randomly picking one, he's got a good reason to randomly pick one. So I don't see it as utterly arbitrary. So the claim is that you see this in Sam Liebens and Tyrone Goldschmidt. God always acts for a good reason unless he has a good reason not to. Is the way they state it.
But let me ask you this:
Yeah.
why think that God has a good reason at all? If God has infinite intrinsic value, his creating the world doesn't make the world world extrinsic to him doesn't make the world any better. Doesn't make the world any worse. If that were the case, it's hard to see why he has a justifying reason at all, or a sufficient justifying reason. Now, you and I agree that God is omni-rational. We agree that he's independent. So how would he decide whether to create a world extrinsic to him or not, unless he has a brute preference? Second, even if he does decide to create a world outside of him, how would he decide which world to create without a brute preference? And if you want to claim that God has a brute preference, I want to know in what way is that consistent with God being independent?
Yeah. So I'm not big on preferences because I think these cause weird problems for like the principle of sufficient reason.
Okay, let me start to drop it. But then why think he has a sufficient reason to create a world extrinsic to him if he already maxes out on intrinsic value?
Yeah, so I want to deny that. I just think when we're talking about infinity, we're typically just playing with words. So I think mathematicians are lying to me when they talk about infinity, and then they're like, "Oh, actually, there's other infinities that are larger." And I'm like, you just lied to me. Stop it, stop it." So I think the infinity stuff is just crazy. So I want to drop it entirely. Now I think God has some sort of unsurpassable value. I don't know how you quantify that, but I don't think that God realizes all values in himself. I think that's logically impossible for God to realize all possible values in himself. Because there's one value, like the value of the creator-creature relationships, that can't be realized within God by himself.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're short
Yeah,
on
yeah.
time. Apologies. But
Yeah.
if God doesn't realize all values himself, it seems that he does have a sufficient reason to create. And if he has a sufficient reason to create and he's omni-rational, why isn't he compelled to create? Why isn't the fact that he would be making the world a better place if he creates something extrinsic to him and he's omni-rational dictate that he has to create a world extrinsic to him? That is, I'm not sure. I'm not seeing why you don't think.
Right. Yeah, because I haven't developed it yet. Yeah. No, this is the right way to push. So as I see it, if you're going to try to satisfy like a sufficient reason, all you need is a justifying reason. You don't need a decisive reason. So this is where I think Leibniz is like sneaking in some other claims in the way he develops the principle of sufficient reason. So I think you just need merely justifying reasons. And then again, justifying reasons are things that you'd be rational to act on behalf of, but not irrational for refraining from acting on behalf of. The further claim is there would be certain values that would be instantiated if God were to create, but it's not clear that it would necessarily make the world like better overall. Because I don't understand how to quantify like these different values, like God's unsurpassable value.
But sir, again,
Yeah.
but if they're not sufficient reasons, that is, if there's a
Hmm.
tie between the reasons, then it's arbitrary. And if there isn't a tie, then he's compelled. That is, it seems to be a dilemma. If creating a world extrinsic to him really does provide a sufficient reason, that is, a reason that's better than its absence, then he's compelled to create. If it doesn't, it's arbitrary. Arbitrariness conflicts with his independence. Sufficient reasons can contradict the notion that he's free not to create.
So are you thinking that sufficient reasons have to be contrastive? Is that what you're?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, because I'm going to deny that. Like Tim O'Connor and Alex Bruce are also people who would want to deny this. So yeah, I think that's going to be where the disagreement is. I don't think.
I don't understand how you can have a non-contrastive sufficient reason. That is, if you're deciding between A and B, and A really is the better choice than B, it's got to be contrastive. If A is not better than B, it's still got to be contrastive in order for you to say it's neither better nor worse.
Mhm.
If they're incommensurate, we can't say we can't compare it. We can't say that they're equally good. So I don't
Yeah.
understand. I'm well aware. I mean, as you make a good point, people like Tim O'Connor is an outstanding philosopher.
Yeah.
Says that we can have non-contrastive reasons. I cannot
You
make
just can't
sense
get
of
it.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I cannot make sense of that whatsoever.
Let's see if I don't know how quickly I can state this. So Proust, I'll just tell you the conclusion of Proust's argument because I can't state it quick enough. The conclusion of Proust's argument is supposed to be that when you're looking at all the cases of contrastive reasons, it really just boils down to you acted on the basis of A, and that's why you did A, is because of the reasons in favor of A. That like the contrastion is just like is irrelevant. I don't know how to develop that in 20 seconds. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I like
Yeah.
your point, but the reason I have to respectfully disagree
Yeah,
is
exactly,
I think there is no way to develop it. I mean, if you're
Right.
responsible for choosing A over B, then it's got to be the sense in some way that A is better than B. If A is not better than B, all things considered, it's arbitrary. And if it's arbitrary, you can only make the decision with a brute preference. And if you can only make it with a
Finish
brute
up your
preference,
last sentence.
you're not responsible for it.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So we did, towards the end of this, we have 15 minutes set aside for audience questions. Now I have been watching the questions. So far, one of the main questions that I've seen come up is I don't understand the words that they're using. So there hasn't been a whole heck of a lot of questions coming in. So I'm curious if you guys would be okay with changing the format just a little bit. And if you're not, that's perfectly fine. So instead of doing 15 minutes at the end for questions, if you guys would prefer doing 15 minutes open dialogue now and then finishing with closing statements, because you guys seem to be having a great conversation.
Yeah, it's fine with me. Is that okay?
Yeah, if you guys are fine with that, then yeah, we'll just open up the floor to you guys and just try to keep it clean.
I went last, Ryan, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what because there was a couple arguments you got into that you didn't get the chance to develop. I want to hear more about the why God would have to create. Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. Explain that a bit more because you ran out of time in your opening statement.
So imagine that God has, let's just say that the 600 units of value is the maximum amount of value that is possible. And God has 500 units in and himself. But if he creates the universe, it adds 100. So therefore, if he creates a world extrinsic to himself, he's making the world a better place. Now, if he's omni-rational and he's all good, there seems to be no reason that he would not create the world extrinsic to himself. But if his psychology dictates that he create a world outside himself, and he's omni-rational, which is your kind of God, it would seem that he would have to create in every possible world that he's in. When faced with that decision, he'll always create the world extrinsic to himself. So you might say, well, he's necessitated to create the world of himself, but I'm wondering in what sense is he not compelled by his psychology? Note that he can't revise his psychology. So in what sense is he not compelled to create the world if it moves the amount of intrinsic value units from 500, which is his amount, to 600, which includes him and the extrinsic universe?
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm starting to kind of get where you're up to. So the follow-up question I had here. So what exactly is the problem that they're wanting to pinpoint here? Is it that if he's compelled, he has no free will? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
no, there's two parts to it. Number one is if he's compelled, then it looks like he's not responsible for creating the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Number one. And if he's not compelled, it looks like he's arbitrary, and then I worry about his independence, because I think what you need is something like a brute preference to say, well, if he's not compelled, how do you decide? How do you decide anything unless you use a brute preference when it's an arbitrary decision?
Yeah, like Bradley Rettler and oh, I just forgot the other guy's name he co-authored with. They've got this new Cambridge element on divine personality, and Andrew Bailey. There we go. And they think that like these preferences, they're not brute. They just somehow like essential to God. I couldn't make sense of it though. But I just think it's like it's something that you might want to become aware of, because there's people who want to push back in interesting ways. I just struggle to make sense of it. Now, with the compulsion case, though, I'm curious about exactly how it undermines God's free will. So, do you think that there are cases in your own life where that rationality demands you do a particular action?
That rational, yes.
Yeah, and do you think like that's like you're still responsible or free in those cases?
Yeah, but I'm not omni-rational. I mean, I
Sure.
can make poor decisions. God cannot.
Yeah, but like in this case though, it's like there's like rationality demands you do one thing, and you do it. So like so your worry is not about that rationality demands it. It's that you could do otherwise because you could have like a weakness of the will or an ignorance of it or something like this.
Yeah, I mean, if we assume libertarian free will, yeah, you might think I could do otherwise, or you might think that, look, I could just, I could make various errors in thinking like that. But none of these things apply to God, right? He can't have weakness of the will. He can't have clear-eyed wrongdoing. He can't have, negligence. So none of the things that, I mean, I do lots of blameworthy things, but God
Right.
can't do any of those.
Yeah. Because it just seems odd to me to say like there's a best possible like there's a best action in this case. Rationality demands that that you do it, and God's like, yeah, I recognize the reasons and I'm appropriately responsive to it. And part of what it means to be free is acting on the basis of like objectively good reasons. So I do it, and I'm like, therefore he's not free. Like I feel like I'm missing a little something here because it sounds
Here,
like like
here,
compulsion, but
here,
I'm like, when you explain what the compulsion is,
here's how you can
it's
see that
reasons.
God's not free. And I'm going to steal kind of the thought experiment
Yeah.
from Peter Van den Wagen. So God's in a situation, he can leave the world at 500 intrinsic value units, which is how much he has, or he can create an extrinsic world, which adds 100, so there's 600. And he thinks, oh, well, look, I want to make the world a better place, so I choose the 600. And then we roll back the tape 1,000 times, and each time he chooses the same thing. In fact, his psychology dictates it because he has a processing rule that says when a choice makes the world better, in fact, much better, I will do that. And that processing rule trumps any other part of his thought. In what sense would he not be dictated to create the world with 600 intrinsic value and rather than 5? Right? I mean, if you're a libertarian and in every possible world he does the same thing, you might think in what sense is he free, or you might think if there is just an overpowering rule, in what sense would he be free?
Mhm. Okay, I've been dictating this conversation, so yeah, you want to take it over for a second?
Sure. So yeah, I guess the question I have with you is I'm worried about, let's say that God is deciding which world to create, and the world, let's say you're right, that there's either no infinity or there's only finite numbers. So he's creating numbers 1 through n. And he has to choose which number to create, but for any number he could create, he could always create a better world. Now, how do you pick a number? Well, you could use a random number generator, but you have to decide then which random number generator to use, which function to use. You could use a creative flourish, but why this creative flourish rather than another? Really, it's a claim about brute preference. And I'm sure those guys are great philosophers, but I just disagree with them that it's not brute preference. I have no idea how you can pick numbers 1 through n without being brute. So my question to you is twofold. Number one, how does he pick which world to create if they're all finite numbers? And 2, how does he pick it without using a brute preference?
Right. So you're talking about like universes that are assigned to the numbers, not like creating numbers itself, right?
Well, they're amounts of goodness, right?
Right.
With
Okay.
one, 2 units of goodness, 3 units of goodness.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I see what you're saying. Because I want to make sure we're not talking about creating numbers because it's a different conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm writing a book on this at the moment, and I'm still trying to work this out. One of the things I'm frustrated with a lot of these conversations is they're talking in terms of these very abstract numbers. So like Mark Johnson will say like, well, yeah, God's infinite. So like God's reason to create cannot be to add value because if you add any value to infinity, it's still infinity. And I'm like, well, if we're talking in terms of just abstract, like these very abstract notions of numbers, I think we're missing something very important. So if I say God creates X value, oh, well, then the total amount of value is still infinity. Okay, that doesn't sound very interesting. Whereas if I say, well, God wants to create like Stephen because like Steve is really valuable. It sounds a much more interesting kind of claim. And surely you're not self-deprecating enough where you're like, oh well, I mean, I'm not that great, like, and I don't think you're that great, but you're kind of cool, like enough, like cool enough for God's like, yeah, that's a reason to create. I don't have to because you're not like so amazing. I have to create. Like, why not? Like let's start. Let me stop with that point before we get into more. Like, does that make sense a bit?
Yeah,
Like,
it makes a lot of sense, but I still think you're interested in total value because you're choosing between different people and different numbers of people.
yeah,
So you could create Steve and you could create Steve's twin brother, or you could just
Mhm.
create Steve, right? So the question is, and second, you could create Steve, or let's say that you could create as Paul instead of Steve.
right, exactly. Okay, so this is good because what I want is it's time of playing with these abstract like numbers and stuff to really talk in terms of like concrete goals that God wants to bring about, and then seeing what kind of universe is needed to bring about those goals. So, for example, if God wants to create a universe where He fully determines everything that happens, well, there's certain kinds of features the universe is going to have in order to do that. And so you can start talking in terms of like a universe where there's like fully naturalistic, deterministic laws. So none of this quantum mechanics nonsense. That would be the sort of universe where God would create. And now I've got like some actual like content I can understand instead of just playing with numbers and variables. If God's goal is to create a universe where there's lots of indeterminism and chance, perhaps He wants to create a universe with an open future. Well, now there's like a completely different set of things we're looking for, and I can give some like kind of interesting details of why that's the case. And these things I can. It seems to me I can get a better grasp on how you compare and contrast them than I do when we're just talking in terms of X unit of value and this or that. I'm talking about actual like values that I can grasp and think about that you and I deliberate about all the time. So that's kind of the basic framework of how I'm thinking about this. Is stop with all the abstracta because that's fun for a while, but let's talk about actual concrete values that we can grasp that I think would fill in the story. So let me pause there because I don't know if I've
So
actually
I
answered
mean, I
your
think that's a
question.
great point, and you do really good. I've read your stuff on this, and it really is fantastic. But I guess I have two concerns with it.
Mhm.
Number one, life's full of trade-offs. And when you create one world versus another, if you're not going to use numbers, it's unclear how you're going to do it. I mean, you might think that things are incommensurate. That's one claim, but unless you think they're incommensurate, which again I can't make any more sense of than I can make of some of these other things, it's not clear why you wouldn't numbers. I mean, numbers are what allow you to make trade-offs. And number two, if there really were like incommensurate values, because you could create, Steve, or you could create, Al,
Mhm.
and you think, okay, well, they're incommensurate. One's not better than the other. How would God decide that without brute preferences? That is, in your view, does God have brute preferences? And is that consistent with the sort of things you said about him being like self-sufficient and ase
Mhm.
and self-explanatory?
I just realized there's some part of my work that you've read that I didn't bring into the story. So I said so in my little book about a big God that you read. I talk about God having certain natural desires, like certain desires seem quite natural to follow from God's nature, and one of them follows from God's love. Uh, and the natural desire that would follow from love would be to enter into relationship with any possible self-conscious creatures that God might create. Yeah, if God decides to create them, then He would want to enter into a relationship with them. I don't know how much time we have because I don't know if I've got time to develop this.
You have 4 minutes and 4 seconds.
Okay, so let me try to develop this a little bit. So I think that that love is an essential attribute as well, but it's a contested attribute. That's why I didn't want to put it in a debate. But let's be contentious. Why not? So love. I take love to be when you love a person, it involves like a trio of values. You see that if they exist, you would recognize the value of their existence. You would recognize the value of their flourishing, and you would recognize the value of some sort of unity or relationship with them. And so because you recognize this value, then that's a reason to motivate you to perform a loving action, which is one that promotes their existence, flourishing, and some sort of unity with them. And if this is an essential attribute of God, which again I acknowledge is very contentious, if this is an essential attribute of God, then I think that would give rise to certain natural desires. So these would not be brute preferences. This would be natural desires. The natural desire would be that when God's looking at the great chain of being, he would see that if I were to create these potential beings that are in the category of something like persons that have this, sort of self consciousness and so forth, then I would be able to see like the value of their existence, the value of their flourishing, and the value of having a relationship with them. So I would naturally desire to have a relationship with them if I were to create them. Now, does that sound brute to you, or maybe I've missed something? I don't know. That's I guess that's the question.
Well, I think I mean, I agree with you on your count of God. I think it's brilliant and well done. I don't think that solves the issue though. God still has to decide, should I create A or B, right? I want to, let's say that the three things are true, that I'll value the person's existence, her flourishing, and my relationship with her. But still, I still have to make a choice. Should I create A or B? And I don't see how you do that unless you either rank them, A is better than B, B is better than A, they're equally good, or you say they're incommensurate, in which case you do an arbitrary preference. Secondly, the level of being. You could create beings at the level of human beings, sort of moderately evil, moderately smart, moderately responsible, or you could create massively good beings, right? So if human beings are at level 200 in terms of our overall abilities, but you could have created beings at level 2000, why create such minimally talented, flawed beings rather than much better beings? So I think, while I think your theory is an excellent account, I think that's the heart of perfection, omnibenevolence, which consists of love. I don't see how that gets around the problem of brute preferences. And again, my suspicion is that you don't like brute preferences any more than I do.
No,
probably for the same reason. We probably dislike it for the same reason. Where we differ, as best I can determine, is whether we think that God's locked into using brute preferences. Now, some of our opponents in the theistic community, they think that God does use brute preferences, or they cite creative flourish, or they think he used a random number generator. But I gather you and I are highly suspicious of these brute preference, these covert references to brute preferences.
Yeah. So we've got what, like 2 minutes, right?
51 seconds.
Okay, so let me run one idea very fast. So when I'm looking at the great chain of being, there's this debate about where do you start, and a lot of people say like Avicenna and Plotinus, they're like God starts at the top and works his way down. And Graham Oppy's got these arguments for God would only create at the top. I'm trying to develop some arguments that go that's just nonsense, that's incoherent, you can't possibly do that. And then start at the middle, that's nuts, that's crazy, don't do that. And try to run this argument where you have to start from the bottom and work your way up. And how do you start from the bottom and work your way up? An evolutionary universe where you start with very simple beings that can develop in complexity and so forth. This is what I'm hoping to do. And the end goal would be able to say, if God's trying to maximize or trying to hit like as many things on the great chain of being as possible, the best way to do it would be to start at the bottom and work his way up. That's the big idea. That was garbage to just try to throw it at you there at the last second.
Finish your last sentence? Or
That's it. That's all I got.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. I feel like if I gave you guys 2 hours, you guys would just go and and very, very civil conversation. It was really cool to see. So what we have left is closing statements, which will be about 3 minutes each. Now, I did steal some of your guys' time with the open dialogue we didn't plan for. We did have some questions come in. If you're open to it, we can do the questions. If you're hard on time, we can skip them. It's completely up to you guys.
I'm happy.
No, I'm
You're good to do it?
happy.
Awesome. All right. So we'll leave it up for Ryan right now to finish with his closing statement. Ryan, whenever you are ready.
Okay. So when it comes to talking about God, there is a very strong temptation to use a lot of ambiguous superlatives to describe God. And as a believer, I understand this temptation very well. So there are many times when words seem to fail when I'm trying to express how amazing I think God is. But these unexamined expressions, they can often betray us and introduce all manner of incoherence into our theology. But I think good philosophical debate can help us expose the fuzziness in our thinking and help us clarify what we really think about ultimate reality. So I want to thank Stephen for helping to expose what I think are actually very serious problems in the ways that theists typically express themselves. And so my hope is that a healthy debate like this one is going to lead to hopefully all of us to do better, to seek out truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, what I presented tonight is just a fraction of some of my current musings on the nature of God. And notice that I said current, because debates like this, what they do is they often push me to revise some of my thinking. Up to this point, I've published 5 books and 70 articles trying to explore just various aspects of rival models of God and associated religious doctrines. And this brief debate that we've had tonight, it just barely scratches the surface of a lot of issues that I think are worth exploring. So while I've done my best to try to defend the coherence of theism tonight, I don't want anyone to think that we've somehow settled the matter, because that's just not true. That's not true at all. Instead, my hope is that this debate has piqued your interest enough to help you go deeper into these debates over God and the story of the world.
I just say real quick, 5 books and 70 articles and the most humble man on the internet. We have to say that for sure.
I'm not humble bragging. I'm just bragging.
All right, Stephen, the floor is yours. Whenever you are ready, we'll start the timer.
So thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to debate with Ryan. It's good when you debate a theist to date, the very best, and Ryan is certainly that. So outstanding thinker, and it's a pleasure to talk to him and to talk to all of you. I've argued that God is not responsible. I think I've shown that he's not responsible because 1, he can't perform evil acts and he knows it. 2, he's compelled, and 3, he's indistinguishable from an instantly created being. So someone might say, so God's not responsible, so what? Well, so what? It's a real problem. I mean, if theists want to say that God's not responsible, they're in some trouble here. 1, why would you ever worship a being which is not responsible? That is, worship makes sense if and only if you're grateful to someone, and you should be grateful to and only to someone who's responsible. If God's not responsible, you shouldn't worship him. 2, theists often use the free will defense to the problem of evil. They don't have to, but they often do. Well, it's an odd view that it's important for humans to be responsible or free, but not for God. 3rd, they often cite that the purpose of this flawed earth is soul building, free and responsible soul building. Why is that good for human beings and not for God? And lastly, on some accounts of Christianity, God sends some people to hell and some people to heaven permanently based on their free and responsible choices. Again, why would that be so important for human beings but not for God? There's a real incoherence about the different attitudes towards freedom and responsibility in human beings and towards God. Second, I've brought up the idea of God creating God's features. If he is not uniquely maximally good, either because there's different ways to exemplify maximal greatness, or because there are infinite numbers of higher infinities, or there is no infinity, there's increased finite numbers. If he's not uniquely great, then he's not the greatest possible being, because there is no greatest possible being. If he is the greatest possible being, there's no reason for him to create a world extrinsic to him as opposed to not create it. It's arbitrary. And if he does create a world extrinsic to him, it's arbitrary as to which world he creates. Well, if you're making arbitrary decisions, then you have a brute preference. And if you have brute preference, you're not independent in the sense that your psychology and your existence are depend on either randomness or something extrinsic to you. That is, you're not independent. So I claim, in short, the greatest possible being is impossible, and hence theism is incoherent. Thanks for listening to me.
Awesome. And thank you guys so much for doing this. That was amazing. Now we're going to open the floor to some questions for these two fine gentlemen. The first question actually comes from me. It's a hugely debated topic in my chat, and I'm hoping 2 philosophers can finally solve it. Is it called pop or soda?
I'm from a particular spot in the Midwest where you specify what drink it is, because pop, that's too north of where I'm from. And soda, I don't know what that is. Like, I mean, come on now. So yeah.
That's one for me. Steven?
I grew up in the tri-state area. I never heard pop until I moved to the Midwest.
Oh, so we're 50-50.
I wasn't even sure what people were talking about when they talked about pop. 100% soda.
All right. So the first question comes out for Steven. Says, wouldn't it be a great making property that God is not beholden to anybody, given he is the object standard of goodness by which we measure?
Right. So I think this is a really good point, that you might think that God is maximally good and that's the standard. But I think the issue is, does God create, like the divine command theory issue, does God make things good, or are they good independent of him? Well, if God makes things good, then it would seem that goodness is arbitrary, right? He could have made pleasure and kindness good, and sort of cruelty and harming people bad, or he could have reversed those. But these things are not arbitrary. In addition, when someone says God is all good, They mean to be something significant, not that God made God who he is. So if what's good or bad, right and right or wrong is independent of God, even if God is an excellent standard for what we should aspire toward, that still doesn't, I mean, I think it's a great point, but I don't think it diffuses these issues. I think there's still issues of whether theism is coherent. So, thank you.
Okay. And Ryan, would you also want to add to that, or?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay. So the next question, let me see, where was it here? It was for Ryan. Says, Ryan, how do you reconcile God being both in and out of time? It seems to be a logical contradiction.
That is a logical contradiction. There's no, you got one or the other. So the way to reconcile it, well, there's no reconciliation. Uh, I like, my view is that God just is temporal, full stop. So yeah, I've got 2 books I've written on the topic if people are interested.
Okay. And Stephen, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know if this is poor form. Can I just ask Ryan a question? I'm curious as to what he says in this. He's one of the leading figures of this. I'm curious if you think that God foreknows what he himself is going to do in the future or decide.
Yeah, so this is a dirty little secret that that no one wants to talk about, which I think is hilarious. So when you're looking at like theological determinists and Molinists and open theists, they all agree on this one thing, which is before God decides to do anything at all, the future is completely open because God hasn't determined any of his actions. So like Molina's like really clear on this point as well, but then he tries to like hide it by embedding all of these in like these logical moments in God's timeless moment. It gets really just nuts really fast. And that seems right to me. So there's a Calvinist named John Feinberg. He was one of my professors during my master's. He said the same thing. He's like, yeah, before God decides anything at all, the future is completely open for God. And then God decides to create a fully deterministic universe and a fully deterministic timeline. So I think that is like got to be the starting point for like Calvinist, Molinist, and open theist. Is this sort of like God initially faces an open future?
I just one question. But if God knows exactly the content of his psychology and he knows how he reasons, how could he not know for certain what he's going to decide? And if he knows what he's going to decide, how is he any more free than if God knew what you or I were going to decide to do?
Mhm. Yeah, because one of the things I guess the disagreements between you and I is I don't think that there is a best, like I don't think God has decisive reasons to do one particular action in this initial state. So if there were, then like I don't even think it would make sense to talk about God deliberating in this case. Like if there were a decisive reason from the start. But this is a problem I see in a lot of theologians is where they'll say God doesn't deliberate, but then they'll give you this long, detailed story about how God does deliberate, and I'm like, what are you talking? Like, so William Lane Craig does this in his new systematic, where he's like, God deliberates, and then like 100 pages later, he's like, no, he doesn't, and I'm like, what are you doing? So this is, I think, an issue that theists really need to work out instead of having these dirty little secrets. They need to put them in the open the air and start debating them. Is my view on the topic, at least.
All right. Next question we got is for Stephen. It says, Stephen, how do you bridge the is-ought gap?
Good. So I like the question. I think that if someone thinks that morality is objective, or if you're like a philosophy nerd, if you think that moral realism is true, you might think, look, it's just a fact of the matter that certain naturalistic facts are going to be right or wrong or good or bad. Now, perhaps they're non-naturalistic facts that supervene naturalistic facts, but there has to be like a necessary connection if there's going to be objective morality. So I do think that if you think that morality is objective, that is independent of what we think, then you're going to have to say, look, there just is a supervenience on morality from the natural world, in the same way that you might think consciousness supervenes on the firing of neurons.
And Ryan, do you want to add to that?
I mean, I think something like that seems plausible to me because I'm a moral realist, and I don't think that the moral facts are reducible to the natural facts. But there's got to be some kind of supervenience relationship or something of the sort. I find supervenience quite fuzzy at times, but I know what the moral philosophers mean when they say these things. I know what they're gesturing towards, at least. And so I do think that when you're looking at the world, the ought gap just really isn't there. So I remember Evan Fales, who's a really good atheist philosopher, one time telling me, he's like, you just look at a child, like a human child, and you can just see that is a vulnerable thing you have to take care of. He's like, I don't care, like you can just see it. And I'm like, that seems right to me. That seems plausible to me.
Awesome. All right, guys, just a quick reminder for the chat. If you do want to get a question in, Super Chat's a way to get it at top. And make sure you pin it with like a Q. That way I know it's a question. And then preferably, please give a letter to who you're speaking to, either Stephen or Ryan, so I know who to address it to. Next question comes in. I'm not too sure who it's addressed to, so I'm just going to say it, and you guys tell me who you think it's addressed to. It says, I feel like it's important to ask what attributes God's goodness comes from. It's not his psychology or power, but his character that he chooses. I think that one's for you, Ryan.
Okay. Yeah, because in my opening statement, the way I articulated it is that when you're looking at the most power granting set of abilities, one of those abilities is cognitive excellence, which is the ability to like know things in the right kind of way, and be appropriately responsive to lots of different kinds of values. And so what I did in the opening statement is I drew a connection from power to cognitive power to perfect rationality to perfect morality. So that's the way I think it. So it's grounded in like this is the way that the inferencers are supposed to go. Now Stephen might have a different way of like thinking the way the inferencers are supposed to go. So I'd be curious to hear about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, my view is actually pretty similar to Ryan's. I do think that God's essence is that of perfection of the greatest possible being, and I think the heart of that, and this is where Ryan and I think disagree a bit. I think the heart of God's great making property is his essential moral goodness, and I think the essential moral goodness just is and only is a psychology. So I think that his greatness depends on and only on his goodness, and his goodness depends on and only on his psychology. So I just think, look, when we talk about God, we want to focus on, does he max out intrinsic moral value? That's what we're looking for.
Awesome. Next question comes out for Stephen. Says, wouldn't it be a great making property that God is not beholden? Didn't we already read this one?
I think you did. That was the first one.
It must have come in twice. Okay, we'll get rid of that.
That was a good question. We could answer it again.
Well, I'm trying to find one for Stephen.
Ryan, I can do a whole second and third round on the same question. So
here's one that I think might be for both of you. It says, how can we infer the world is better and or good without an initial world to compare to? And I'll say, Stephen, if you want to take that first, or if Ryan, you want to take it first, whichever one.
I don't know. Go ahead.
So let's say you thought a vacuum world with nothing in it had zero value. And you might think, well, a world with like 100 very happy people have ecstatic lives is better than zero value. So I think you can compare it that way. If you thought that if there were no world extrinsic to God, so nothing out there, let's say you thought that was similar to a vacuum world, you could compare it, 100 units to zero. So I'm not sure why those comparisons are so high, why the comparisons are impossible. Now, you might think the question of, well, if there's no space out there, what is it that is the bearer of value? Some sort of, nerdy technical concern. But leaving that aside, I don't know why we can't just say, look, how many happy people are there? How happy per person? Total up the amount, and then get a value function. It doesn't have to be happiness. How virtuous are they? How loving are they? Whatever you think is the value maker. I mean, why can't we add it up in an arithmetic manner and through that decide how good the world is?
That seems right to me, because when I'm thinking about this, I'm like, well, I'm looking at like abstract possibilities. So I don't need a concrete world, I guess, to make the comparisons. Now, if these abstract are just don't exist at all, then I feel like I'm a bit lost. But I'm not always that tempted by nominalism anyway. So, yeah.
And I think next is probably the most important question that we had, something that everybody needs answered for Ryan Mullins. Is that a real bookshelf behind you? I think to your stage left.
So this one is real. This one is fake.
That just a fake bookshelf for kicks and giggles?
Well, so my wife and I were trying to like make this office space look more like YouTube friendly. And so it wasn't just a blank wall. And then I had this, there's this band called Make Them Suffer from Australia that I really like. This deathcore band. And so I got like a flag of theirs. I put it up, and she's just like, it looks like you're in your 20s. And I'm like, I'm happy to look like I'm in my 20s, keep going. But like, so she just thought it looked childish. So she was like, no, let's put this up. And yeah.
And I guess that leads to the next question. Stephen, how are we to take you seriously without a bookshelf behind you?
That's a good. I think that's a good guess. I'm not doing enough reading, so. I mean, it's NFL season. I mean, how much reading can you do during NFL season?
Fair enough. Fair enough. So I think we have another one for Mullins. Says, can you explain why choosing between A and B, you don't contrast A and B and only decide on A, even though both of their goodness can be evaluated?
Mm-hmm. So the claim that, like, if you deny that the principle sufficient reason entails contrastive reasons, the claim is that you're acting on the basis of A. I'm sorry, you do A because of the reasons in favor of A. That's why you do it. Like full stop. Like that's the claim. How you try to like fully develop that, it's a lot more complicated story. But that's the short answer: is why are you doing A? Well, because the reasons in favor of A.
And do you want to add on to that, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think these reasons are contrastive. I mean, imagine you're deciding what to do. You're deciding, should you marry person A or person B? You have to think, okay, what are the, which do the reasons better support, or decide, should I go into philosophy or should I be a physician? You look at the contrastive reasons. Same thing with morality. You think, okay, should I, join the war effort, or, to use Sartre's example, stay home with, take care of my mother. I mean, I don't understand how there's any sort of decision that's going to be either right or wrong, or for which you're going to be blameworthy or praiseworthy, that doesn't involve contrastive reasons. In fact, I don't even understand how it's even possible. Now, I do agree that there are leading philosophers who put forth this idea, including outstanding philosophers. Ryan mentioned Tim O'Connor, and Ryan as well. But I just, for the life of me, I can't make sense of how something can be right or wrong unless it's supported by the fact that one reason is more normatively stronger or stringent than a second. Same thing with regard to what would make someone praiseworthy, blameworthy. You're praiseworthy when you act on what you see to be the stronger reason, suggesting there really are stronger and weaker reasons.
Next one is also for Ryan. Says, does your model for objective morality overcome the Euthyphro dilemma? Am I saying that right? Euthyphro. It sounds like you're arguing God has perfect moral knowledge, not that he is the fundamental source of morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I left my position completely agnostic on this question because there's different ways you could develop it. So some people like T.J. Mawson at Oxford will say you've got God, and then you've got just all the necessary moral facts, which are just propositions, just floating there independent of God. Now, God's reasons are always based on these necessary moral facts, and there you go. Like and then whatever God creates, then He creates some contingent moral facts, and this is how the story of how you get the full moral landscape in the world. The short version of it. Now, what a lot of people want to do is they want to put those necessary moral facts in the mind of God, and say that okay, well, so God's aware of all the necessary moral facts; they're not existing independent of Him. And so when God creates a universe, He creates all the contingent moral facts and then all the other things you do to insert into the story to get the full story of the moral landscape. Now, either way you go, God's options are the same. So I don't exactly understand the advantage of having the moral facts outside of God's mind or inside of God's mind on this sort of story. There might be some other independent reasons why you'd want to put them one place or the other. But in terms of making God like the source of morality, like I don't see it making too much of a difference, honestly.
Awesome. And Stephen, do you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I do want to add to that. I suspect Ryan, I agree with this, but I do think this is kind of a counterexample of the claim that God is the ultimate basis for everything in the universe. If you think the Euthyphro dilemma is correct, then you think God is not the basis for goodness or badness or rightness or wrongness. But if that's the case, it's a little hard to see how he's the basis for everything if he's not the basis for morality. Similarly, you can ask, is God the basis for God's creative powers? Well, it's a little hard to see how God can be the basis for His creative powers. His creative powers are kind of what lead to everything else. They might be the basis, but He's not the basis for His creative powers. Again, and this is not my idea, but I'm stealing this from. So I just don't understand the notion that God is kind of the ultimate explanation for everything. I mean, He might be the explanation for most things, even the vast majority of them. But the notion that He's the basis for everything, I just don't see how that could be correct. For example, God's not the basis of His own essential goodness. his own greatness, right? Because his greatness explains why he exists and has the essence that he does. So I guess I would agree with everything Ryan said, and then add to it. I think this shows that God is not the ultimate source of everything.
Yeah, I see what. Yeah, go ahead. So sorry.
So just to keep time going, if it's all right, I'll just jump to the next question. How are you guys doing for time?
Yeah, I can do another question or two. Yeah, it's fine.
Awesome. So the next one comes in for both you guys. Says, how can an ontic agent ground ontology if its own existence already requires it? That makes the grounding relation circular. And I think I'll give it over to Steven first.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just flat out agree with that. I mean, it must be alter ego writing this. Yeah, I'm not sure how if God's essence explains why he exists and perhaps why he has the psychology that he does, then he can't explain his own essence, which is kind of a variant of what that point is.
Okay. And Ryan?
I guess I'm not seeing the problem here because so God exists, and I would think that God's essence is grounded in God. And the reason God is great is because he has all the perfections. So I think I'm seeing some of the explanation in the reverse order from Stephen. And I'm missing what's circular here. Because if it's necessary, well then it's necessary. So I think I'm missing where the circularity comes in. So yeah, I feel like I'm just failing to understand the question.
So let me. I'm just a variant.
Yeah, try to explain this. Yeah.
So let's say you thought that God's essence is being the greatest possible being, and his essence explains why he exists. But then his existence can't explain his essence, right? I mean, because that would be circular. So then what would explain why he has this essence rather than some other? Well, you might think, well, it's just a brute fact. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I guess I wouldn't think it would be brute. It would be the natural stopping point for explanation. Because when we're trying to come up with an ultimate explanation, you have to stop somewhere. And if there's no other like reasonable or meaningful questions left to ask, then you've found the natural stopping point. So I think when you hit like necessary existence, that's a natural stopping point. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm seeing. I don't see how that would be brute if it's necessary.
Well, I think it would be brute in the following sense. I mean, I gather both you and I think that abstract universals necessarily exist, and that's not a problem.
I'm strongly tempted by that. Yeah.
But when it comes to concrete particulars, and if you think of objects, for those people, think of objects. Even if an object necessarily exists, we want to know why it necessarily exists. And so that requires an explanation. Now it might be the explanation is, the modal ontological argument, but it still seems to be that necessary existence is not the stopping point. Kind of something like the modal ontological argument is the stopping point. And maybe that's correct. But I guess what I'm saying is, doesn't that show the stopping point depends on and only on the modal ontological argument?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I'm going to deny this because I think that I think the modal ontological argument is trying to show that God exists, whereas if you're doing something like perfect being theology, that's just a method for trying to discern what God is like. And I think these things can come apart. So I'm not seeing why I'd need this argument to establish that God necessarily exists if I've got other methods for doing that. Yeah.
But let's say the other methods are something like the principle of sufficient reason. We'd still need an explanation as to why this necessarily existing object exists at all, or why it necessarily exists. There's got to be something that explains it. It can't just be that it is a necessary object. Like that doesn't seem to be the fundamental explanation.
Oh, I guess that's where I'm going to disagree because I think when you hit necessity, you're like, okay, there we go. Because so for example, like when you've got these theists that want to run these moral arguments for the existence of God, and they're like, there's these moral facts and they necessarily exist, and you're like, yeah, okay, cool. I'm a moral realist. All right, end of story. And they're like, no. Why are they necessary? And they try to start pushing this kind of stuff and try to ground it in God. I'm like, I guess I don't see why. Like, if it's necessary, then why do I need to explain further? This is like a common like a response to these theistic objections to morality. So I feel like the same thing would be going on here. Is like I've hit necessity. I don't understand why I have to keep going. Like it seems like that's the stopping point.
Sure, I guess I just think that.
All right, gentlemen.
We got to go on this.
Yeah, we got to jump on to the next questions. We could do it all day, but we do got a few more to get through. So the next one says, how do you reconcile God's perfection with his act of creation? Actions are goal-orientated and thus presuppose scarcity. Would a perfect God create? I think this one is more towards you, Ryan.
I don't understand why there'd be like why has to be scarcity. Yeah, I think I'm just going to reject this presupposition. Like actions that are goal oriented presuppose scarcity. Why should I think a thing like that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Stephen, do you want to add to it? Or?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. I
Okay,
don't know
perfect.
why we have scarcity.
All right.
Yeah.
The next one comes up, says, if God doesn't exist, why argue his non-existence? I think this is for you, Stephen.
Okay, so there's several reasons I think that if God does not exist, we want to show that God doesn't exist. Number one, you might think that our lives go better if we have true beliefs, right? So just in terms of aggregate well-being, you might think it's good to operate on true beliefs. Secondly, you might think false beliefs are bad in and of themselves. Either they're bad because they make individual lives go worse, in addition to having bad results. So that's a second reason. And the third is just a matter of look, regardless of what makes our lives go better, and regardless of whether false beliefs are just instrumentally bad or whether they're intrinsically bad for us, that is make our lives go worse, we want to have true beliefs. I mean, do we really want to walk around with false beliefs? And let me put an important argument to the contrary. You might think that if there were solid evidence that people behave better if they think God exists, that might be a good reason not to publicly argue that God doesn't exist, because it's going to make the world a worse place. That is, we do better if people if people do believe that God exists, regardless of whether he does exist. I'm in no position to evaluate whether that we have sufficient reason to believe that. But I just think, look, false beliefs have three bad things. One, you might think false beliefs are bad in themselves. You might think they lead to bad results, and you might think they lead to other false beliefs. So those are the three main reasons that if God doesn't exist, we want to be able to publicly show this.
And Ryan, do you want to touch on that?
A little bit, yeah, because I think that part of the pursuit of happiness is trying to be properly attuned with reality. And if you try to be properly attuned with reality, you need to know certain things like what exactly exists, and then what do I do about that stuff that exists. And so if it turns out God does not exist, well, there might be a lot of knock-on effects depending on what you think God is like and the sort of promises that are and other claims that are wrapped up with this. So like different religions are going to have different claims about what God supposedly does and is promised to do in the future. And if all that's false, you don't want to orient your life around that. You want to orient your life around something else that actually is going to bring you happiness that really is attuned with reality. So I think that's why you would want to engage in these kind of arguments.
Awesome. We do got a few more. We're almost through it there, gentlemen. The next one says, I'm not too sure who it's for. It says, can you sort out of elaborate how brute preferences or reasons violate aseity and why nested arb discussions don't solve this? Because Ryan, this is similar to your impassibility argument. No, thank you both. I think it's for you, Ryan.
Oh yeah. So the argument I have about impassibility is that impassibility prevents God from having any reasons at all to create, like full stop. So you don't even get into the realm of like nested arbitrary decisions or choices. It would just be an utterly arbitrary action. And I've got a lot of there's a lot of details for how that's supposed to go. So the first part of the question is like, can I sort out how brute preferences or reasons violates aseity? I don't think brute preferences or reasons would violate aseity, because aseity is just that God's existence is not dependent upon anything outside of himself. Where the brute preferences might be a problem would be in terms of self-sufficiency. Like, well, not necessarily self-sufficiency, but like, why exactly does God have the nature that he has? And the answer is supposed to be, well, because this is just what perfection demands. Whereas brute preferences, those really like perfections? Like, what's going on there? That's where I think the problem would be. It wouldn't be necessarily for aseity. So I think this is just a completely separate issue from the arbitrary creation argument that I have.
And Stephen, do you want to touch on that?
Yes, I want to agree with Ryan. So I'm going to repeat what Ryan said. I'm just going to say in a slightly different way, which is that I think independence is a great making feature. And by independence, I mean that God's essence and his existence don't depend on extrinsic things, and they don't depend on randomness. But if God's preferences are brute, and by brute I mean nothing explains them, it seems that they're random. But if they're random, then God's not fully independent. If he's not fully independent, he's not the greatest possible being. So that's why I think that God cannot have a brute preference. But if he can't have a brute preference, he can't decide which world to create. And I claim he can't decide whether to create a world extrinsic to him or not.
Awesome. All right, gentlemen, we have 2 more questions. This one actually comes from the gentleman who facilitated this debate. This comes from John, says, and it's for you, Stephen. I can't bring it up, so I'll just read it for you. It says, do you believe God has intrinsic responsibility as a divine great-making property, in the alone world, essentially? If he doesn't, then doesn't that mean this property is not great making and essential, rendering it dispositional? John, you got too many spelling mistakes in there. Go ahead.
So great question. If God were to be responsible, then he'd be responsible both in the world containing only God and in the world containing God and a world extrinsic to him. So I think you're right to be concerned about whether or not responsibility would be just a disposition to be responsible, or whether to be actually responsible. But as argued, I think we have strong reason to believe that God is not responsible. So if that's the case, there's 2 ways to go. We could say, yes, so what? Responsible is not a great maker. Or we can say, well, we should have a different view of responsibility for God than humans. They're 2 different responsibility properties. I don't find that second way a very plausible way to go. You might think, look, if we know what responsibility is, it is what it is. Let me just say one other thing about responsibility. We really care about responsibility in our lives, right? We want spouses, who are responsible. We don't want Stepford wives, right? We think that we don't want to go into the experience machine because we'd only have the experience as if we're responsible. We wouldn't be actually responsible. We think dessert matters, right? If we're giving up units of pleasure, we'd rather give these units to good people. Like we'd rather give 100 units of pleasure to good people than 101 units of pleasure to prison rapists. Why? Because they deserve worse, and dessert entails responsibility. So the fact of the matter is, we really care about responsibility. But if we care about responsibility in humans, why wouldn't we also care about it in God? So I like John's question. I just think it's true that if God were responsible, he'd be responsible if he was the only thing in the universe. But he's simply not responsible.
And Ryan, do you want to touch on that?
Briefly, yeah. So when we're looking at responsibility in our daily lives, we already find ourselves thrust into a moral order that we did not ask to be placed in. Whereas I guess I'm seeing in the alone world, where God exists all alone and he hasn't done anything, there's not really any sort of moral, like, the moral landscape's really thin. I don't like, there's like some necessary moral facts, and I'm like, that's cool. But there's no set of obligations, because who's God obligated to? There's no one else around. He's not made any promises. He's not doing anything. So I think the responsibilities kicks in once God creates a morally interesting universe, and then we find ourselves in a morally interesting universe, which is where I think that's why we care so much about all these concepts of basic desert and blame and praise and all that. And I think that once God creates a morally significant universe, that's when God's going to have consequences as well, like obligations to do this or that. Yeah, I think he's going to have to be responsible for it in that way. But I think this is accidental to him. Yeah.
Can I do a quick follow-up? Sorry. I'm curious, Ryan, whether you think that God would be praiseworthy or blameworthy for not creating a universe. That is, that he, even before he creates the universe, if he's deciding whether or not to create it, and then he makes a decision, wouldn't he be praiseworthy or blameworthy in virtue of creating it, not only after it's been created?
I think I misunderstood the question slightly. So if he's all alone, is he praiseworthy or blameworthy for saying, "I'm not doing anything"?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, I don't know what's like. There's no one to praise God. I guess God could praise himself, but that seems silly. So I just don't know it just seems kind of odd to me that God would be praiseworthy for not doing anything at all, because there's no morally significant action that's been chosen in this case. So yeah, I think it's just a category error in this case to talk about praise or blame.
So the next, probably the most important question comes from a mutual friend, Than Krista something or other. I can never say his last name. Can't handle all the handsomeness in this stream. He's not wrong. Not wrong. So last question, I think it's a really good question to end off on. Can you guys both steelman the other's position? Is that something you guys be willing to do?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Ryan, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So when I'm looking at a lot of these different arguments against the existence of God, some of the ones that I do take to be quite the strongest really are this intuition that God's perfect, so God would have to do the best. The difficulty I find is trying to establish exactly what it means to do the best. But a very strong intuition throughout a lot of Western history is that what it means to do the best is to maximize all possible goods. And so this is often called the principle of plenitude. And I think there's a lot of I can understand the intuitive force behind it. And so the principle of plenitude says that goodness has to like be necessarily diffusive. It just has to create more good things. And the problem with that is that entails a modal collapse. Like if God has to create as many like good things as possible, and well, why not create all the good things that are possible? Well, then like God has no decisions, there's no choices, there's no freedom there, and there's not going to be freedom for anything else. So that seems to me like a very serious problem. And there's a lot of models of God that are going to grant all of this. I think what Stephen's hitting on does attack quite seriously a lot of different models of God.
And Stephen, are you happy with that steel man?
Yeah, yes, I very much am. And I would like to say I find Ryan's position extraordinarily strong and it's very difficult to attack. I mean, one way to understand Ryan's position is saying, look, God's the greatest possible being. And by that, I mean that he has every consistent great making property to a maximally degree, so long as it's consistent with the other ones. And that makes it difficult to attack because you think, okay, if I attack this property, you say, well, look, if it really is inconsistent with the other ones, then he doesn't have it. If it is consistent with the other ones, then he has it. So in some sense, it makes it extraordinarily difficult to attack. And then Ryan further strengthens his position by saying, look, I don't think it's the best possible world. So we don't get a modal collapse. We don't, have human beings and God losing responsibility or free will in that sense. I don't believe in brute preferences. So, I don't lose independence. So I think it's an extraordinarily strong position, which is why I think that Ryan is one of the very best theists in the world. I mean, it's just a real pleasure to listen to him and consider his arguments. So an extraordinarily powerful view.
Ryan, you happy with that, steel man?
I mean, just stroked my ego. Like, I mean, how could I disagree?
Awesome, gentlemen. Well, that's all we have for today. So I figure we'll leave it with some plugging. Everybody always wants to plug their own channels and what they're working on. So we'll go through you guys one at a time, and then we will sign off. So Ryan, what are you working on? Where can people find you? What's happening in your world?
Mm-hmm. So you can go to rtmullins.com. You can find my podcast, the Reluctant Theologian podcast. Two different books are going to come out. I don't know which one's going to come out first. Either The Incarnation, Four Views, which is a debate book that's edited by me and Andrew Hollingsworth. Is probably going to come out first. The other one is called Letters from a Reluctant Theologian, where it's me and a bunch of other people who massively disagree with me on everything, where we give our own personal, funny, witty, vulnerable anecdotes and reflections on the universe and God and just the peculiarities of faith or lack of faith.
Awesome. And Stephen, what do you got going on in your world?
So I am, along with my co-author Nathan Bray, I'm working on a book called God Collapses, in which case we develop these arguments for atheism in greater depth. So that's what we're working on, and it's been it's been pleasure, but it's been difficult because we've been running up with these sorts of like these sort of tough positions to attack, such as Ryan's.
Awesome. And Coco, what's going on in your world?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm part of a page called Day of Debates on TikTok. So it's literally like if you spell out Day of Debates, no spaces, no periods, where me and my two other co-founders of that page, AR and OG Kylo, we're trying to bring professional debates to TikTok. A lot of debates on TikTok are informal and, insults go flying. People like to call it blood sports. We're trying to bring professional debates and interview like very prominent people who do philosophy or talk about science or theology and are in the field. So I'm posting debates and hosting debates there on Day of Debates, and we have an event coming up at the end of this month. I'm planning it for November 28th. It's going to be a Day of Debates event, Day of Debates 10, where I'm going to have multiple debaters, very prominent people in the community debating. And then I also run my personal channel, The Controversial Compass, a space where only the best ideas win, where I debate people, I host debates, and There are days like man-to-man Mondays where I have 1v1 debates, and then there are days where I have conversations trying to figure out what I believe in and understand and steelman what other people believe in. I'm an agnostic, and I'm open-minded to God existing, but I can't really decide between atheism and Christianity. So those are the two projects I'm working on.
Well, I have a vote for you on which direction I want you to go. All right, guys. So those who don't know, I'm Big John Steele. I've been running this channel a while. I primarily do open dialogue and conversations where I do a call-in show and people can call in and debate me or have just a basic conversation. Usually ends up with debating and yelling and people getting angry. But hey, that's where the entertainment is. We love Jerry Springer. It was the best show on TV. If you guys want to support this channel, you want to help it grow, you can support it on Patreon. A link is down below where we offer exclusive content. We offer basically you get access to exclusive content, you get access to our hangouts, our raids, and then I'm also going through a Bible study where we're currently going through the Gospel of John line by line. You can support the channel there. Or if you don't want to do that, just make sure that you like, subscribe, just do everything that everybody tells you to do when you're watching YouTube. I want to thank my guests for coming on today. I think it was a wonderful debate, much better than the Bloodsport debates, very civil. I think I learned a lot. I'm definitely going to have to go back and watch it 15 more times and with 20 dictionaries because like I one ear out the other, but I was focused. It's difficult to comprehend. So I really appreciate your guys' time and coming on today. And hopefully we can do it again in the future. All right, ladies and gentlemen, God bless. We will see you all next time.
This was an amazing debate.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure. Thanks.